property that is motivated by hate, bias, or prejudice based upon the victim's race, national or ethnic origin, language, color, religion, sex, age, mental or physical disability, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, or any other similar factor. And I'll ask you to note in that definition that we're therefore dealing with something that is a criminal offense. Second of all, that it's directed against either a person or property. Third, that it's motivated by hate, bias, or prejudice, and that hate, bias, or prejudice is based upon certain descriptors of the victim. And for the purposes of our conversation, we're going to pay particular attention to the victim's religion. So we're going to deal with anti-Semitic hate. We're going to deal with the victim's national or ethnic origin. So we're going to deal with the victim's status as Israeli. And so you will see that it also says, or any other similar factors. So it gives sufficient discretion to deal with hate crimes that don't fall within the strict language that I've just described. Now, when it says that the crime must be motivated by hate, bias, or prejudice based upon the victim's, for example, religion, the criminal or the perpetrator don't have to be right, in the sense that if someone is attacked because the offender believes that you are Jewish and you're not, that's still a crime that's motivated by hatred against Jews. Similarly, we see a lot of instances in hate crime where people are attacked on the basis of being perceived to be members of the LGBTQ community, and they may not be. But nonetheless, that is a crime that is motivated by hate, because that is the intention behind the crime, and that's the important component of it. So an offender doesn't have to be right about the race, the religion, the national or ethnic origin, the sex, the disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, in order for it to constitute a hate-motivated crime. Now, if you go through the criminal code, and I don't recommend that for you because it's about 1,800 pages, but if you were to go through it, you'd see many, many criminal offenses. And any one of the criminal offenses that exist can be hate-motivated crimes. So, for example, if you hit somebody on the street and you don't have any excuse for it, that's an assault. But if you hit somebody who's Jewish because they are Jewish, that's still an assault, but it's also properly labeled as a hate-motivated crime. So there are lots of crimes that may be hate crimes or may not be hate crimes, depending on the facts in each case. So to give another very common example, mischief to property is an offense under our criminal code. And mischief involves, for example, throwing a brick through the window of a home or an institution. So if you throw a brick through the window of a home because you don't like your neighbors, because you're in a dispute with them over fences, then that's a mischief, but it's not a hate crime. If, on the other hand, you throw a brick through a house because the occupants are Jewish or Israeli or Muslim or members of the LGBTQ community, that's a hate-motivated crime. It's still a mischief, but it's a mischief with this enhanced characterization as a hate crime. Now, I'll stop there because you may be asking the question, what difference does it make whether it's characterized as a hate-motivated crime? And one of the main reasons why it's important is because hate-motivated crimes are supposed to be dealt with by the police in a very different way than conventional crimes. And we'll discuss that in a few moments. But it's also important because judges are directed under the criminal code to take into consideration the fact that an offense is motivated by hatred. And they're supposed to take it into consideration in determining what sentence to impose upon an offender. So, for example, there should be a very different treatment when someone is sentenced for throwing a brick through a neighbor's window because of a dispute over a fence and throwing a brick into a window of a neighbor because they're Jewish. And why should there be a difference? Because there's a greater need for general deterrence, in other words, deterring other hate mongers from similar activity. It has a greater impact because it affects not only the victim, the homeowner, it affects our entire community. And that's why when you have hate motivated crimes, one of the things that a number of the Jewish organizations have been involved in, and I've been involved in, is assisting in the collection of community impact evidence to present to the court so that the court recognizes that this is a crime that reverberates throughout the community and has an impact. It affects our feelings of safety. It affects our feelings of security. It affects our feelings of belongingness. And no community should feel at risk. And that's why the criminal code says what it says. And judges can't act upon a hate motivated crime unless they're provided the evidence that demonstrates that the crime is indeed motivated by hate. So I'm going to come back to that in the context of how you report a crime that you believe to be motivated by hate. Now, if I were to give you a primer again on criminal law, I would divide hate crimes into 3 different categories. So I'm going to talk about each of these categories, and I hope you'll find it helpful because I find all too often people don't understand what is a hate crime, and as a result, they may be reporting things that don't rise to the level of hate crimes, or they may not be reporting things that are indeed hate crimes. So I'm hoping that this primer will help you in performing our community responsibilities in addressing hate. So the first category is criminal hate speech. So we recognize in Canada that some forms of speech are so vile, are so harmful to the targeted community that we criminalize them. And for those of you who watch the American news and watch the protests that take place in the United States, it's all too easy for people to assume that the laws that apply in the United States have equal application in Canada and vice versa, and it's not true. We have more robust laws if they're enforced. We have more robust laws to address hate speech that occurs in our communities. So we have 4 offenses under the criminal code that specifically address hate speech. And I'm not going to go into them in great detail. I'm simply going to tell you what they are and give you a little bit of an overview. So the first one is advocating genocide. So if someone is proposing, other than in private conversation, because these hate speech laws apply to conduct that's taking place in public or other than in private conversation. So the first one is if you're advocating for all Jews to die, and we've seen examples of this. And by the way, what I'm going to describe in some of the instances is distasteful, and I apologize for that, but I don't really apologize for it because it's important to talk frankly about these offenses. So that's called advocating genocide, and it represents probably the most serious of the hate speech laws that exist. The second is inciting hatred against an identifiable group likely to lead to a breach of the peace. So that sounds very legalistic, but I'll break it down for you. The person must be inciting hatred, in other words, trying to promote hatred through conduct against an identifiable group. An identifiable group includes Jews, Muslims, people who are distinguished by religion, includes people who are distinguished by their national or ethnic origin, which would include Israelis and the like. And I'm going to talk about Zionism a little bit later on because there are a lot of misconceptions in policing and outside policing about where Zionism fits into this analysis. because hate mongers try to immunize themselves from criminal prosecution by substituting the word Zionist for Jews. And I'm going to talk to you about why that should be a non-starter for them. So continuing on this hate speech section, inciting hatred against an identifiable group likely to lead to a breach of the peace. And a breach of the peace is basically a disturbance or an offense such as causing a disturbance or an assault. So it's likely by inciting hatred that it's going to result in a breach of the peace. And the breach of the peace doesn't have to be immediate. In other words, if somebody incites hatred in a crowd by saying next week, when we celebrate, and you're going to see this, when we celebrate in a few weeks, October the 7th, and we celebrate the barbarities of Hamas, I want you to go out and do these things directed against the Jewish community. That would be inciting hatred against the Jewish community, likely to lead to a breach of the peace, even though he's talking about it or she's talking about it as something in the future that is being encouraged. The third is probably the most commonly referred to section, which is the willful promotion of hatred against an identifiable group. And willful means really deliberateness. In other words, that your raison d'etre, your rationale for doing something, is the promotion of hatred against an identifiable group. And the fourth category is promoting anti-Semitism by condoning, denying, or downplaying the Holocaust. That's a relatively new section of the criminal code. And the reason it was introduced is, as you know, one of the most virulent forms of modern anti-Semitism is Holocaust denial. And we see that continuing to today. We see this around the world. And so this is a specific section that addresses conduct that condones, denies, or downplays the Holocaust. And for those who would say, why single out Holocaust denial amongst the kinds of hatred that might take place, there's a very simple reason, and that is that when this section was passed, Holocaust denial represented one of the prime modern manifestations of anti-Semitism. And so the goal here was to make explicit what previously was implicit, and that is Holocaust denial constitutes a form of hatred. So I've told you a little bit about the four hate speech sections. So let's talk about the use of the term Zionist, because I always hate, this language about you've got to give context. And so let me explain when you have to give context to things that are spoken, and when the context is so obvious that no analysis has to take place. And I'm going to preface it by saying that when we talk about hate speech, we're not just talking about people talking out loud at a protest. We're also talking about speech that's communicated by telephone. We're also talking about speech that is communicated through the internet. And indeed, the internet represents and has represented now for a number of years the most prevalent place in which hate speech is promoted. So let's talk about context. If somebody says, kill all the Jews, you don't need context to decide that that's hate speech. That's promoting genocide. It's clear. And that's why when university presidents in the United States, in their appearance before the US Congress, were asked the question, is it violating your university policy to promote genocide against Jews? And their answer was, it depends on the context. It was absolutely ridiculous. And it was, in my view, anti-Semitic, because the message that was being communicated was that you need some context in order to decide whether or not the promotion of genocide against Jews violated university policies. And if anything violates university policies, however they're framed, it's the advocating of genocide. So, but what hate mongers now try to do is they try to immunize themselves from criminal prosecution or civil liability by saying we're just into a political dispute. We're condemning Zionists. We're not condemning Jews. And there's no doubt that there are people out there who hold political views on the issue of Zionism, and it doesn't, in all instances, make them anti-Semitic. But here's the litmus test. And it's an important litmus test for us to remember when we're deciding what constitutes a hate crime and what does not. And that is, let's start with the polling that shows that 91% of Jews in Canada are Zionists. So if a statement is made at a rally that says, kill all Zionists, or I pray for the death of all Zionists, that person should not be immunized from criminal prosecution because they're advocating that you kill Zionists, 91% of Jews falling into that category. So in my view, it's a very clear case where you are engaging in anti-Semitic hate speech when you say things like, let's kill all Zionists. And by the way, it is strategic, as I've said, on the part of hate mongers to try to use Zionists even when they really mean Jews. And one of the parts of the training that I'm involved in with policing is to explain how you look behind the language to recognize that when Zionism is being used as a proxy for Judaism and when Zionist is being used as a proxy for Jews. So if you say kill all Zionists, that's not a political statement. That is the willful promotion of hatred against Jews and against Israelis. Similarly, at a protest, and this is one of the most misunderstood areas in our criminal law, in my view, if you say at a protest, all Zionists are evil, all Zionists are genocidal, all Zionists are racist, that is not a criticism of the government of Israel, its policies, the conduct of its war, the political positions of settlers, far-right extremism. You are labeling all Zionists without distinction as evil, as genocidal, as racist. And in my view, that is clearly the willful promotion of hatred against Jews. Now, not every obnoxious speech constitutes hate speech. And we have to be careful to remain cognizant of that. So many of us in the community are upset when we hear obnoxious, one-sided, unfair speech condemning Israel's conduct in the war in the most unfair ways. And again, within the spectrum of Zionism, we can be extremely critical of Israel. Indeed, some of Israel's harshest critics at times are to be found within the state of Israel. But it's important to draw this distinction between criticism, even unfair criticism of Israel and its policies or conduct, and speech that demonizes all Zionists and Zionism and the very existence of the state of Israel. Now, I'm always asked the very same question, and that is, what about from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free? When it is chanted, does that constitute hate speech? And this is a very difficult topic in the Jewish community. And why is it a difficult topic? Because we know how related it is to the genocidal chants by Hamas. And many of us rightly regard it as absurd that in the immediate aftermath of October the 7th, when Hamas is chanting this very phrase, that people are giving benign interpretations to it when it's taking place on our streets. But the reality is that, and I have to be completely objective about this because it makes me a more effective advocate. And that is that some courts have recognized that some people who chant the phrase do not intend it in a genocidal way. Now, you may not accept that. You may accept it. In my view, there are people that chant the phrase that don't even know what it means. They don't even know which river, which sea. They have a naive understanding that somehow the phrase is tied to some kumbaya moment where everyone can live in peace. And people may at times have a more benign meaning associated with the phrase than the genocidal chant as it is taken by the Jewish community. So the challenge is in presenting a case to the police and the prosecution is to differentiate in how that phrase is being used. So I'll give you an example. And that is that if the phrase is used in a chant from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free. But then the Arabic version of the phrase is also being chanted, which is from river to river or from water to water, Palestine shall be Arab. Or we've seen in some instances that the chanting has been accompanied by from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free. And then from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be Jew free. Then there is a compelling, if not overwhelming case as to how the phrase is being used. So it's very, very important from a perspective of community, not to be overcome by the emotion associated with the use of terrible phrases that should have no part in dialogue in Canada, but instead focus on all of the circumstances surrounding the chants that take place in order to make the case, if a case exists, that indeed this rises to the level of hate speech. And I can do that same kind of analysis in relation to much of the rhetoric that you've heard on Toronto streets and also in streets across the country. So justifiably, Jews listen to the call for a global intifada, and they know what an intifada is because it was experienced twice in Israel, and there was no benign intifada that took place in Israel. But on the other hand, in terms of proving a case beyond a reasonable doubt in a criminal court of law, it's important to gather all of the background circumstances to see whether that phrase is being uttered together with, as I've said, from river to river, Palestine shall be Jew free, or together with by any means necessary, or together with by any means necessary and a picture of a submachine gun being pointed while people are in military garb. So the simple answer is that it's too easy on the part of some to dismiss all of these examples as not rising to the level of hate speech because they don't say, let's kill Jews. But looking at all of the circumstances, some of these protests, some of these speeches on the internet undoubtedly rise to the level of hate speech under our criminal code. And some of them present overwhelming evidence of hate crime for the reason I've suggested. Now, so all of this is a lesson that it's not sufficient to simply pick up on a phrase that is offensive to the Jewish community. The goal in being effective in reporting hate crimes is to differentiate between those cases where there's any ambiguity and those cases where all of the circumstances point out exactly what the intention of the speakers is. So I've already talked about one category, which is crimes that involve hate speech. So then the second category I've alluded to earlier, and that is conventional crimes that are motivated by hatred. So mischief to property, causing a disturbance, intimidation. Now, I'm going to mention intimidation to you because I've taken the position in policing that the police and prosecution are quite frequently across this country underutilizing a section of the criminal code that is available to prosecute hate-filled activities. And why do I focus on intimidation? Because how many times have you been told or have you heard in dialogue that is taking place in the media or elsewhere that if somebody wants to exercise their freedom of expression, they can block roads, they can block tunnels, they can block bridges to exercise that freedom of speech? Well, there actually is a section of the criminal code. It's called intimidation that was specifically designed to address situations where people are trying to compel you to do something that you otherwise entitled not to do, or compel you not to do something that you're entitled to do. And they try to compel you to do these things. They try to persuade you to do these things. They try to persuade the community to do these things. They try to get adherence to their position by blocking highways. Now, under the criminal code, highways include any road that involves vehicular traffic, any road, any bridge that involves vehicular traffic, any tunnel that involves vehicular traffic. So you can see why in training that I do, I ask the police that not to necessarily focus on the things that we tend to focus on, willful promotion of hatred, but to focus on, for example, the offense of intimidation, because it specifically addresses the blocking of roads. Similarly, mischief. Mischief doesn't simply involve the damage to property. It also involves the interference with the lawful use and enjoyment of property by others. So a number of the hate activities that we see constitute mischiefs because they are interfering in the use of the space and excluding others from space. They are interfering with the lawful use and enjoyment of property, whether private or public, by others. So I always focus on the exclusion of Jews from spaces because, in my view, that rises to the level of mischief in many situations. So part of this is an educative function so that police and prosecutors understand the distinctions that I'm making here. And part of it is a matter of will, that there has to be the will to utilize the law enforcement mechanisms that are available, including all of the provisions of the criminal code, in order to address hate. So the third category, which I'll briefly deal with, are specific offenses designed to address hatred that don't involve speech. So I'm going to give you two examples. So we now have under the criminal code specific offenses that relate to religious institutions, religious schools, religious community centers, religious-based seniors residences. And so if you commit vandalism, an act of vandalism that's directed, for example, to a synagogue, that's directed to a Jewish day school, that's directed to a Jewish community center, a seniors residence, that is now a separate offense prosecutable under the criminal code. And why is that important? Because I and others went to parliamentary committees years ago to urge the creation of these sections. And why did we do it? Because we wanted to elevate mischief, which sounds like a relatively innocuous offense, a relatively minor offense, to heightened seriousness when it involves religious institutions or our schools or community centers. So you should know, in the context of reporting, that a mischief to a synagogue, we all know that that's a criminal offense, but it also extends to community centers, to schools, senior residences, and interestingly, and underutilized, it also extends to objects associated with these institutions. So if there's a statue outside a school or a school bus and so on, in other words, objects that are associated with these institutions, damage to those objects constitutes this elevated offense under the criminal code. And finally, the final offense that I'm going to refer to is interference with a religious ceremony or a social gathering. So, for example, if a synagogue service, and I'm using anti-Semitic instances here, knowing the composition of many of the people, the composition of the participants tonight, but it has equal application right across the map. And I don't condone hate crimes, whether committed against the Jewish community or others. But my examples are focusing largely on the Jewish community tonight. But for example, if a religious service is taking place and protesters are preventing that religious service from being conducted by their activities outside the synagogue, that can constitute the offense of interference with a religious ceremony or even a social gathering under our criminal code. Now, so that's a little bit about the offenses. And I know that's going to generate a bunch of questions. Usually the questions that I'm asked is, so why aren't these sections being fully enforced? So I will kind of talk about that in response to some questions undoubtedly on that topic. Let's talk about reporting. And I'm going to use Toronto as the example, but as I said, you have an ability right across the country to report hate-motivated crimes. So you can do it in 5 different ways. So, and that depends upon the circumstances that present themselves to you. So the first is this, that if you are the victim of a hate-motivated crime, or there is an imminent threat to you associated with a hate-motivated crime, or to others, then you call 911. You call the emergency line because, for obvious reasons, an imminent threat has to be dealt with as a matter of urgency. And that means that resort should be had to the 911 number. You should try to always call from a position of safety. You should never expose yourself unnecessarily through the reporting. So you try, and this is a standard of perfection, but you try to put yourself in a position where you can report in a way that doesn't expose yourself unnecessarily or continue the imminent threat through your continued presence in close proximity to the person who's engaged in the hate crime. Don't get into an altercation with hate mongers. We're seeing this happen sometimes, and we're seeing police charge members of our community in some instances because they've gotten into an altercation. And I understand the emotional content here. I understand how difficult it is to watch what appears to be our city and others taken over. But it may make you feel empowered temporarily, but it's rarely productive. So don't take the law into your own hands. And there's also a pragmatic reason why I say that, because it undermines the likelihood that the police will ultimately intervene in the appropriate way. It really does complicate the situation. Number 2, if there's not an emergency or an imminent threat, but you witnessed a hate crime, in Toronto, there is a non-emergency line that you can call, 416-808-2222. Obviously, there are comparable numbers in jurisdictions right across the land. That's the general reporting line. There is no specific, in Toronto, there is no specific hate crime reporting number. So you call that number. Usually there's a response from the local division, and they're required under their protocols to escalate a hate motivated crime case to the hate crime unit in Toronto. The third, you can call Crime Stoppers anonymously at 416-222-8477 or online at 222tips.com. Now, some people do not want, with perfect justification, do not want to be exposed as a complainant in circumstances where they fear that they'll be doxxed or the subject of reprisal activity, and we can certainly talk about that. So you can report anonymously, but you should recognize that it places certain limitations upon the police's ability to act. Because obviously, if you're reporting anonymously, they cannot utilize the content of what you have to say as evidence in any proceeding that takes place. But I never, ever try to induce anyone to report a hate crime with attribution if you're not committed to doing so. I mean, that is re-victimizing victims if we were to ever induce someone to have to name themselves in order to report a hate crime. And there are circumstances in which reporting anonymously can lead to the police conducting an investigation where other evidence presents itself in order to support the hate crime. But that option is available to you. The fourth is if you observe hate-motivated graffiti, there is a specific hate-motivated reporting form in Toronto that exists. So you don't have to engage an officer. You don't have to have an officer attend at your home or place of business. If you go on to the TPS website, you'll see there's actually a place that you can click for hate-motivated graffiti, and the police will respond to the graffiti. If you fill out details about where it is and what it says and why it constitutes hate-motivated graffiti. Don't use that reporting form if the graffiti has absolutely nothing to do with hate, but you want it removed from a building. And the fifth way that you can address hate-motivated crime is through the intermediary of Jewish organizations. And this applies probably most frequently in the context of hate that you observe online. So a number of organizations, including ours, the Alliance of Canadians Combating Antisemitism, and I know that our contact information will be provided to you. We're at, though I will say, we're at www.alcca.ca. But there are a number of Jewish organizations where you can report a matter that doesn't make it a criminal report to the police, but sometimes if you feel security in reporting it to a Jewish organization, then the Jewish organization can evaluate it and determine whether they report something that's observed online in particular or in a protest with the safety and security of having done so through an organization, whether it's ours, whether it's B'nai B'rith, CJA, Simon Wiesenthal. And our organization has, I think, 38 separate organizations under our umbrella, and a number of them also accept reports, and often they'll make their way to me if there's a question as to whether or not they rise to the level of criminality, so we can make that evaluation. What's the biggest problem in reporting hate crimes? You heard that what this seminar or discussion was motivated by is an expression by police that there are some problems in how hate crimes are reported. So the biggest problem that I see is incomplete reporting. So when when members of the community report a hate crime, they've got to appreciate that the gold standard for reporting is providing as much information as possible. They should make it as easy as possible for the police to conduct an investigation. If I report a hate crime, I like to put it in a nice package with a ribbon on it, because it makes it all that much easier to press the point, and it makes it all that much easier, more importantly, for the police to conduct an investigation. So, for example, people will send me videos that kind of 3-second snapshots, sideways frame. I can't tell from looking at it precisely where the location is, what time it was, what date it was. And you don't want the police to be receiving it and immediately be predisposed to treating it less seriously or less effectively because of all the groundwork that would have to be done merely to identify the basics. So you always ask yourself, you have to become your own criminal lawyers in a sense. And that is that you've got to ask yourself, what is the information that I know that can advance an investigation into the matter? Because there is this assumption that if you report a hate crime, that's it. It's over to the police. They take over, but the police have to have an evidentiary foundation for what it is that they're doing. And that's what you can supply. So it's very easy for me. And that is that if you're going to report what you regard to be a hate motivated crime, then what you're going to do is you're going to set out where it took place, when it took place, how it is that you know that it took place, any of the particulars with as much precision as possible as to what was said or what was done, without emotion, but in a straightforward way. And I don't deprecate the emotion that's associated with this. My point is that it has to be factual. No exaggeration, no minimization, precisely what it is that you can say about it to the very best of your ability. If you're observing hate motivated crime, then I would suggest that if you're in a position to do so, you can take notes that are contemporaneous to assist you in preparing a report. So the biggest deficiency that I see in reporting of hate crimes is lack of completeness, which makes the task of police all that much more difficult, and can often produce a result of no action. So let's talk about videos a little bit, because in this day and age, some of the most egregious activities that have taken place, whether they're hate motivated or not, are often captured on iPhones, because everybody has an iPhone and everybody turns on an iPhone. And you've got to remember, if you're conducting a video, if you're taking a video on your phone or otherwise, first of all, you have to assume that somebody else isn't in a position to fill in all the gaps that are missing as a result of the quality or lack of quality of the video you're taking. So you try to capture as much as possible. You don't simply put it on and off strategically, when something offensive is said, but you try to keep the video running. You always think safety first. So if the taking of a video exposes you to a risk, better you not do the video, because your safety is paramount to me and to your community. But if you're doing a video, as I said, many times the videos that I receive are unfortunately not usable by the police because of their poor evidentiary quality. Turned on, turned off, taken at angles, and the like. So what you try to do is you try to remember that you're preserving a record, and you're doing your best to preserve a record in a way that it can be acted upon. If you have other evidence of a hate-motivated crime, you should preserve it contemporarily. So if you see, for example, something that's virulently filled with hate on the internet that would qualify on the criteria that I've described today, take a snapshot. Take a snapshot of it. If you see graffiti, don't simply report it on the forum, but take a picture of it, take a photograph of it, preserve the evidence that you have. So preserving evidence is a very important part of the reporting obligation. If you have any concerns about reporting, I've already said that there are Jewish organizations that exist here that are all too ready to assist you in the task of reporting. It's something that I spend a lot of time on, and you shouldn't hesitate to call upon the organizations that are available to you in order to assist you in this very difficult task. So that's giving you a somewhat lengthy overview of crimes and of reporting and how it's to be done. And I'll ask, is it Talia? Are you going to be the one that feeds me questions? I'm happy to answer any of the questions that have been generated.
Hold on, I've got to unmute her. So hold on. That was amazing. There's so many questions. So it's a good thing that we have lots of time left. Okay, Talia, take it away.
All right. Well, the number one question that has been repeated a few times is, what's the point of reporting these crimes if the police are not enforcing the laws?
Okay. So didn't I predict that would be the question? So I've taken the position, I recently conducted training of prosecutors and police, and I hope that training is very different than the training that has been given in a number of instances. And I've been doing training for many years. The training now has to adjust to the current realities. And that means that police have to be given the range of offenses that I've described. And frankly, I've only touched the surface of the offenses that are available to police. And so first of all, they have to be given the tools to know what is available to them for law enforcement. And in my view, they haven't always been given the tools to do their job. And those tools include not only the criminal law, but also there are provincial provisions under the Highway Traffic Act, Trespass to Property Act. There are municipal bylaws because we are in an environment in Toronto where Jewish rallies obtain permits for their activities if they interfere, for example, with the use of certain spaces. There are no permits being obtained by the rallies that we're talking about here. So one of the things that I think has to happen is that the police have to have a better understanding of the tools available to them. And then there has to be a different approach to the exercise of police discretion as to when criminal charges are laid, because there's no secret about it, and I have communicated it as recently as today, that I see too many instances where police are not enforcing the law in a way that is appropriate. And I should say, so they have to know the law, and there has to be the will to enforce it. And so I'm trying to work on both of those areas. It's the prime focus of my own activities, and we have to see a sea change in this. And some police services are better than others. Some police services are applying the tools that I've described. Others are not. And I have to say, when people talk about the Toronto police, it's a little bit of a mixed bag, because one of the things that I don't think has been done effectively is that there have been a significant number of charges that have been laid, but the community doesn't know about them. And so there has to be a better job of communicating what they are charging, but I still think they are very significantly undercharging in cases that clearly fall within the category of hate speech or clearly fall within intimidation or mischief. So it's an area that I'm working on and others are working on. We have to see an improvement, absolutely. And I can tell you that in some areas of the country, I'm starting to see some improvement, and I'm trying to work on it here. And one of the things that we see is a misunderstanding as to the law. So it's not simply not knowing the law enforcement measures that exist, but the most common thing that I hear is that freedom of speech basically trumps everything else. And it's not the law. If you go onto our website, I've written about this because the law is actually the opposite of how it has been portrayed. For example, in relation to the encampments at the University of Toronto, for example, in relation to the training camp that was outside McGill, I see instances where there is such a gross misunderstanding of the law and what freedom of speech entails. Freedom of speech does not immunize you from prosecution for hate speech. And equally important, freedom of speech does not bring with it the right to speak wherever you want, whenever you want, and regardless of the impact that it has upon the lawful use and enjoyment of spaces, private and public, by other members of the community. So this is a point that we have to keep hammering home. So if you go onto our website, for example, you'll see the submissions that I made to the Toronto Police Services Board, because it's got to start with the board's policies on protests, demonstrations, and occupations. The Police Services Board is obligated under law to have a policy on public order events. They don't have a policy on it. They have invited submissions that they've received about 600 submissions on it, and they're going to be engaged in consultations around it. And you'll see what I've recommended. And I've recommended a zero tolerance for hate in the treatment of protests, demonstrations, and occupations. I've also recommended that the police should consider, I think, 19 separate factors in determining whether or not they're going to take law enforcement measures in relation to protests, occupations, and demonstrations. And I do want to make clear, because I know I'm preaching to the converted for many of you, but I do want to make clear that I value freedom of speech, that I've been a proponent of the right of freedom of speech in a variety of contexts. And I also recognize that a number of protest activities that take place do not necessarily fall outside of the protection of the law, but too many do, and too many remain unanswered. So we have to do a much better job on this. And that involves really the community engaged with police and prosecutors, and others in positions of responsibility to ensure that we approach hate crimes in a very different way than we are currently approaching them in many jurisdictions. Sorry, you're muted. Sorry, Revy, you're muted, so I can't hear you.
She's coming. She's coming. She keeps muting herself, and I have her. I
Okay,
have this.
yeah,
Oh,
sorry.
oh, sorry,
Won't do that
sorry.
again. Kids in the background. Okay, so there are several questions that will really follow up on this one. Number one is, should we all be making reports about laws that are being broken at the protests? And if yes, what are those laws that are specifically being broken at the protests, let's say in downtown Toronto? You mentioned that a bunch of charges have been laid, and we know that certain frequent flyers have been charged, but we see the charges being laid, but then we see them back on the street the very next week. So how is
Right.
that happening? So if let's follow up with those two, and then I'll ask.
Okay. So dealing with the first question, and that is that I don't expect people to be versed in the criminal law in their reporting. I gave you a little bit of a primer on the criminal law, largely because I'm very selective in what protests make their way to the police on my part. So I've drawn some distinctions for you, but to be frank, I'm less interested, and others may disagree, but for me, generally speaking, the major protests in this city are recognized by Jewish organizations and are the subject of reporting if they appear to cross the threshold. But when in doubt, there's no harm in reporting protest activity. But as I've said, it's really got to be the most egregious conduct before it crosses the line. I can't pretend now to give a full explanation of every law that exists that should address protests. When in doubt, as I said, you can utilize Jewish organizations as an intermediary and say, this is what I witnessed, say it in great detail. One of the things that I have taken the position on is that some police forces videotape every major protest that is taking place in Canada now. Some are not doing that and have to be doing it because we shouldn't be playing catch up. We shouldn't have to require citizens to videotape a major protest in order to evaluate whether the law is being violated. So I know one particular jurisdiction not only videotapes every major protest that's taking place, but also has an Arabic speaker attend if the protest is being conducted in Arabic and English, so that you get a contemporary view of whether a contemporaneous view as to whether the limits of protected speech are being violated. The second question that you posed, refresh my memory. I have a good memory, but it's short. Sorry, you're on mute again.
Okay, this time out, Revy. So Revy, the kids are gone. You don't have to mute me. Anyways, the question was, if charges are being laid, and we do know that charges have been laid, why do we keep seeing the same frequent flyers back on the street the very next?
Okay, so the simple answer is that that we have a criminal justice system that presumptively gives bail to people who are charged with offenses. We generally don't detain people prior to the trial on the merits. And as abhorrent as the conduct is that is the subject of today's discussion, nonetheless, there is jurisprudence that gives the right to be at liberty pending the determination of a case on its merits. Now, having said that, it's very important that when terms are imposed as conditions of release and the terms are violated, then prosecutors and police should be taking a hard line on whether that person should be released a second time. And we have, in fairness, we have seen people that have been detained, again, because they're in violation of their terms of bail. So part of the challenge here is transparency, because if there are instances where people are being detained, you don't know about them. And if there are instances where police have laid charges in circumstances where you would have expected charges to be laid, then we need more transparency around that, so that the public doesn't feel that absolutely nothing is being done. So my message may be contradictory, because I'm saying to you that we're underutilizing the criminal law, but I'm also being fair to say that there are a number of instances where we have seen charges being laid in appropriate circumstances, but insufficient attention given to that so that the community is aware of it. Right.
Can you address the issue of masks and, wrapping your head in a keffiyeh at a protest and disguising your identity, and where does that breach the law?
So this was the subject of training that I did last week, because again, we actually have people don't know it. They say, why don't we have a law against wearing disguises? And the answer is, we do have 3 laws against wearing disguises. So if you wear a disguise with the intent to commit an indictable offense, that's a crime in Canada. If you wear a disguise during an unlawful assembly without lawful excuse, that's a crime in Canada. If you wear a disguise during a riot, and a riot is very specifically defined, and it's not what your image of a riot may be, it actually involves a situation where 3 or more people are meeting for a common purpose, and they're engaged in conduct that gives rise to tumultuous breach of the peace. So if they're wearing a disguise in the course of a riot, and I've seen some instances of riots that haven't been charged as such, then that's a crime. So one of the aspects of training that's important here is that the disguise sections of the criminal code can be more effectively utilized. The challenge sometimes is that when police are faced with a very large protest, there is an inclination to record the events and then consider charges after the fact. But it becomes that much more difficult, because if a person is disguised, why are they disguising themselves? They're disguising themselves to try to immunize themselves from criminal liability. So I've spoken to police about strategies that can be utilized to address that issue. In other words, how do you prove the identity of people who are involved when they're disguised? So a lot more work can be done in this area. Absolutely.
So, I mean, obviously the question is then how come these people aren't being charged for disguising themselves? I mean, they're also not being charged for having a riot.
Charges, but it's a recurrent theme when I'm saying to people that I'm very conservative in the use of criminal law. So I want ironclad cases to be the subject of prosecution. And I'm still not seeing effective, timely investigations and prosecutions in some of these instances. So that is something that has to be worked on. So I guess I'm repeating myself by saying that includes the use of the disguise provisions of the criminal code. I can't put it any more forcibly to say the answer to the question, why aren't more people being charged with this, is you've heard my views that I do think that we are underutilizing our criminal code provisions, and we have to work on that issue, because police are used to conventional charges. When they get into the areas of hate crimes, and I'm not taking the obvious examples like the desecration of a synagogue The police are on top of it. They seek to find the perpetrator. There's no ambiguity in it, and so on. When you're dealing with some of the areas of protest activity and you're dealing with the areas of hate speech, there are these countervailing issues. And I think they've also been clouded through kind of false narratives as to what the law is. So we've got to straighten that out. We've got to change the dynamics around how these things are investigated and prosecuted.
So I'm gonna use like a real life example, and then you tell me what I ought to have done, if anything. So, a bunch of members of the Jewish community went to a Take Back the Night vigil march that was being held by the Toronto Rape Crisis Center. Now we had gone, the members of the Jewish community had gone in order to essentially counter protest the Take Back the Night event, because the Toronto Rape Crisis Center had not been neutral. They had taken a pro-Palestinian stance, and they had an event in support of the rallies. And now at the rally, there were several people whose faces were wrapped, like men whose faces were wrapped in keffiyehs, and they put their bodies between members of the Jewish community and the vigil that was taking place by the Rape Crisis Center. Now, do I have a complaint there? Could I have gone to the police and said, I'm being intimidated by men who are in disguise?
Yeah, you're not going to like my answer, but I'll give it nonetheless, which is that I I'm not going to give an opinion on us on that specific instance because I'd have to know there are about 30 questions that I have arising out of what you've said before I could answer that question. So you may have to answer that. You may have to ask me that question offline for me to answer it.
Well, I mean, the idea is like okay, because I think that would have been like a really interesting sort of case study. So maybe what we'll do is you'll ask me all those questions, we'll write it up and we'll send it out to the group as a case study.
Well, depending upon what the conclusion is as to whether it's a reportable matter or not. But remember what I've said, and that is that I focus on the criminal law because it's my field of expertise. But I'm a great believer in the use of other legal measures than criminal law as well to address these kinds of issues. Because if we overutilize the criminal law, then we lose credibility on the cases that really matter. So for me, my focus is on addressing extremists and not everybody who is hate-filled through the use of the criminal law. Like I really reserve the criminal law for certain cases that reach certain levels or involve certain people that, I mean, you and I know some of the people that we're talking about here, and there are a variety of other non-criminal measures, legal and educative, that have to be utilized to deal with some of the other issues. So I don't want to create this false narrative that everything has to be evaluated. There's an all too ready as let's put everything through the criminal law grinder. We don't want to do that. We want to be selective in the cases that we're using. And it doesn't mean that the activities aren't hate-filled that we're concerned with, but we might have to take alternative approaches to them other than the criminal law. There's a special place for the most extreme activity. And by the way, one of the things I haven't talked about for me is the most important thing here is that we are also failing to adequately address as a nation the funding of hate activities in this country. So that's financing and money laundering. That's the financing of some of the hate-filled protest activity by foreign sources. And so it's another area that we have to be working in, because in my view, you prosecute the most extreme hate-filled people, you cut off money sources, and you deal with financing, and you educate the ignorant, the stupid, the uninformed about what is going on, and you utilize non-criminal legal remedies that are also being underutilized in our community. So to give you just one example, if you have a hate-filled sign on a university campus, whether it rises to the level of criminal law or not, there is jurisprudence that exists from our Human Rights Tribunal that says that the university has the right to remove signs that create a poisoned environment on their campus. So, in my view, that decision, which was, by the way, in a case involving anti-Semitic hatred, is an example of measures that can be taken by universities. Similarly, violation of codes of conduct. We saw that the codes of conduct were not being enforced right across the land on university campuses. And so we're giving greater attention to that issue now because of its importance. So you don't need to use the criminal law. You can also use disciplinary processes and enforcement of codes of conduct in order to achieve a result.
Now, it's my understanding, Mark, that you don't need to be a student on a campus in order to make a code of conduct complaint.
So each one of the universities has a procedural manual on making a complaint. Some of the universities take different positions on this issue. In my view, there should be no requirement that a complainant be a student if it relates to activity by a student or faculty member that is in violation of the university's code of conduct.
Okay, back to law enforcement. Now you had said something about there needs to be a sea change in how the law enforcement agencies are approaching this type of activity. What's going to bring that about? And is there an accountability agency, or who's a chief accountability officer who's able to bring about this type of change, let's say, for example, at the Toronto Police Services?
Okay, so for me, there are a number of decision makers that should be addressing this issue. And I think the best answer is that we've created calls to action for people if the community wants to get involved in where they should be making points. And we can recirculate some of these calls to action to people who are registered tonight, or whether or not they're registered here tonight. But the simple answer is that we have to be looking at all of the decision makers in the system. So that's everything from the police services boards to ministers to police services themselves, to the federal government, which does not enforce individual laws, but also, in my view, should be much more proactive in bringing together law enforcement so that we have a concerted strategy in how we're dealing with hate crimes across the country. So I've recommended, for example, as have others, including Anthony Housefather, have recommended that there should be a national task force that is addressing hate crimes so that we have a national strategy in how they're dealt with. Because what I see is very different approaches to hate crimes depending upon what jurisdiction you're in. And I also see a lack of resources, which is another issue that should be addressed. Hate crime units have to be fully resourced in order to do these difficult investigations in a timely way. So
Okay.
those are just a few things.
There's a few, very tough list questions. such as, is a Palestinian flag painted on the side of a building considered graffiti?
So, well, first of all, nobody's entitled to deface a building with anything. You know, if so the answer is that that you're not entitled to paint things on a building that you don't own or have possessory interest in. So so the answer is, yeah, that is graffiti. But is it hate speech? No, nobody's going to characterize that as hate speech, but they may characterize it as a mischief because it involves the damaging of property or or the damaging of property. So so that's the answer.
What
A
if
Palestinian sign, a Palestinian flag alone would not rise to the level of hate speech.
what if it is not a Palestinian flag, but let's say the Hamas or Hezbollah logo?
Okay, so the Hamas logo, in my view, does rise to the level of hate speech because Hamas has been declared a terrorist entity by Canada. It's on the prohibited list under the criminal code that designates certain organizations as prohibited from engaging in activities in Canada. So in my view, if people are wearing are carrying Hezbollah or Hamas flags, if people are wearing Hamas headdress, then that potentially rises to the level of the willful promotion of hatred and should be treated as such. The problem is that unlike some countries, we don't have a specific legislative provision that prohibits the use of terrorist-related symbols. In my view, that's not an impediment to the use of willful promotion of hatred to deal with them. But I have recommended that that Parliament introduce a specific section, such as exists in England, that actually criminalizes the use of terrorist symbols in order to support terrorist activity. So I'm hoping that that should be a no-brainer, frankly, for Parliament. It exists in various countries around the world, and it's tough to see what possible rationale there could be for not criminalizing symbols that are unequivocally related to terrorist activity or terrorist organizations.
So the next thorny issue that people want to address is the issue of APR. Now, APR in its, let's say in one of its more extreme iterations, becomes inherently anti-Zionist. Now, somebody asked the question that, let's say I have a child at the TDSB and there's a APR segment to the curriculum being taught in a particular classroom that is inherently anti-Zionist, or not inherently, but overtly anti-Zionist. Would that be considered a hate crime? Should it be reported to the police?
So it's my view that, and there are a variety of reasons for this, but generally speaking, what is going on in our schools, and it's deeply problematic what is going on in our schools, is not resolved, with some exceptions, with some extreme exceptions, is not resolved through the use of the criminal law. In my view, it's resolved in a variety of other ways. So again, I don't see criminal law as the answer to every hate activity that exists. So I see other measures that are available to address that issue. But it's a thorny issue because as you know, there are several organizations that have promoted a definition of anti-Palestinian racism that basically makes every Zionist a racist. If you define anti-Palestinian racism in a way that means that anyone who doubts the Palestinian narrative as to how the state of Israel was created is anti-Palestinian racist or Islamophobic, then what you're doing is you're basically weaponizing this concept of APR in order to demonize Zionists and Jews. So,
Mark, can I
yeah,
cut you off for half a second and ask you, just as a follow-up to that before I forget? So that would be, dealing with in the school system anyways, codes of conduct. But can people lodge human rights complaints if their children are going to school and feel uncomfortable because their teachers are overtly anti-Zionist?
So, there's a whole. I'd rather save the use of the human rights code to another session on another day because it raises a whole set of issues. I guess what I'm saying is it has to fall within certain categories under the human rights code in order to be treated as a human rights violation. And there's also pragmatic considerations as to whether one wants to deal with it as a human rights complaint, which is a long and difficult process without guaranteed success at the end of it. So in my view, the answer has to be in addressing these things through a variety of other mechanisms, and that is the creation of appropriate anti-racism policies that do not demonize in a way that are really contrary to what anti-racism policies should be about. Second of all is the training of educators and the education of students on anti-Semitism by mainstream Jewish organizations. It doesn't help to have anti-Semitism training taking place by anti-Zionist Jews under the pretext that we're hearing from Jewish voices when the Jewish voices represent 3% or less of the Jewish population. So I see, and I also see a role of the Minister of Colleges and Universities at that level in the directives under Bill 166 in addressing these issues. So there are a variety. It's beyond the scope of today's discussion, but there are a variety of measures that are available other than human rights complaints to deal with these issues.
Is there a way to deal with these issues under any statutes that deal with the teaching of revisionist history?
Well, let's talk about the
Like
reason
for
I'm hesitating. The reason I'm hesitating is I've spent a lot of time talking about revisionist history in the past in the context of Holocaust denial.
yeah, but now
And so,
we have school, we have books in the school boards that label the map of Israel as Palestine
right,
that
right. So,
talk about.
so, right. So, in my view, one of the things that we have to do in dealing with these issues, and I'm being a little evasive now because it's a complex topic um, that takes some time to develop, is that I actually think there are strategies to address these things that don't necessarily engage some of the legal remedies that we've already talked about. But it's a complicated issue that's probably beyond the scope of today's seminar. You may have to invite me back to deal with non-criminal legal remedies at some point.
I think that's a great idea. We'll set it up. So back to something that I think is clearly criminal, but I'm not sure we have a clear-cut path to dealing with it, is the doxing of Jewish community members online.
Right. So I'm not going to talk about this for another reason, and that is that there are some matters that are currently under investigation. So I actually don't want to say much about this right now, but um, absolutely, depending on the circumstances, doxing can rise to the level of intimidation. It can rise to the level of criminal harassment. There are various sections of the criminal code that could apply depending upon the nature and extent of the doxing activity that's involved. So, yes, the criminal law is potentially available as a remedy for doxing.
So can you just describe, what doxing at the level of intimidation or harassment would look like? And also, how do you go about reporting it? So let's say somebody is publishing photos of you saying, who is this person? Who can tell me where they live, for example? or is even publishing, private information like people's phone numbers online? How do you report that? Like, what are the steps?
Well, the steps are, I mean, the steps are easy. The question is, what the police end up doing with it. But the steps are that you've got to document fully. There's two issues that come up. So the first is documenting fully the nature of the activity that is the subject of your concern. So that means, drawing upon what you can obtain from social media that shows this activity that's taking place, rather than having the police speculate as to what's taking place. And the second is identity, because the biggest issue in some of the cases, and I chaired a conference on hate on the internet, because one of the thorniest issues for internet hate isn't whether it rises to the level of hate, but whether you can identify the perpetrators. That's a huge issue for this stuff. So one of the challenges is, as I said, you collect everything that you could possibly collect in relation to the matter, but it's a bit of a challenge because you want the police to conduct the investigation not only in whether it rises to the level of a hate crime, but also whether or not you have provided sufficient evidence that they can figure out the identity of the perpetrators. And the anonymity of the internet has been a problem in hate propaganda since the days back in the 80s, when I was dealing with hate propaganda involving Holocaust deniers like Zundel and Keekstra and so on and so forth. A lot of the hatred was on the internet, and the challenge was identifying the source of the hatred. There is a provision under the criminal code where you don't need to have criminal charges in order to execute a warrant to seize hate propaganda on the internet. But I'm digressing now, because you were really asking me about doxing, and the answer is that you have to fully document the activity that you know of. And then what I'd probably do is, that's where I would probably use a Jewish organization as an intermediary to see, based upon our experiences, whether it rises to the level of criminality such that it should be reported to the police, right?
Okay, anything else? Questions that are coming in is could you elaborate more on hate speech targeting Zionists? Like, at what point does it become hate speech
Okay.
to talk about Israel, to talk about Zionists?
Right. So there's certain categories of obnoxious speech that, despite our distaste for them, do not rise to the level of hate speech. And so I'm going to give you an example. And this is an example that really bothers the Jewish community. But if somebody's chanting and they're saying, Israel's committing genocide, and Israel's killing babies, Israel's, like, all of the inflammatory language that takes place. Now, we'll leave aside the fact that there are members of our community, Zionist members of our community, that are concerned about whether the IDF has done enough to address humanitarian needs and to avoid civilian casualties. The Jewish community can have differing views on that, in the same way as the state of Israel citizens have different views on some of these issues. But that does not rise to the level of hate speech. Very, very sharp, even what you would regard as unfair, one-sided criticism of Israel's conduct of the war in Gaza. When you see all of these things where there's absolutely no balance to the discussion, there's no acknowledgement of Hamas's activities and what contributes to the loss of civilian. So when you have all of that kind of stuff, it doesn't rise to the level of hate speech. But to answer your question, this is why one has to look to the IRA definition of anti-Semitism as informing decisions being made at the legal level. So the IRA definition, which has been adopted by over 40 countries, has been adopted by Canada, has been adopted by Ontario, makes very clear what the distinction is between criticizing Israel and its policies and so on in a way that's similar to how you'd criticize any other country, and the demonization of Zionists and Israel. And in my view, that definition and the examples given under that definition provide some important content to when one's crossing the line in the use of the term Zionist. And for me, I recognize, like, I'll talk to anybody who doesn't want to exterminate me and doesn't want to exterminate Israel and its people. Like, I have a very low threshold for conversation, right? And within the Jewish community, there's a wide range of views, on many of these issues. But for me, I draw the line in the same way as the IRA definition draws the line between robust criticism of Israel that's similar to the criticism leveled against any country for its conduct or activities, and the demonization of everyone who's a Zionist and Zionism and the state of Israel and its delegitimization. Like, I think that's where the line has to be drawn, and I don't think I'm seeing that line drawn in that way. I think it's just all too easy to dismiss chants that only use the word Zionist and don't use the word Jewish as immunized from criminal prosecution, and it's not an appropriate analysis. And I've spent some time talking about that.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, the APR people demonize the IRA definition because they think that it eliminates all criticism of Israel, when in actual fact, that's the definition of APR.
Well, they don't believe that at all. Like, when you hear scholars say we're against the IRA definition because it prevents criticism of Israel, they know it says the exact opposite.
Yeah.
And so they can take the position that it should be more finely tuned. And a number of people have taken this position, including in Israel, that it should be more finely tuned so that robust criticism isn't inadvertently captured by the definition. But the bottom line is that it's very explicit in saying criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic and is not covered by the definition of anti-Semitism, and distinguishes that.
So one question that just came in while we're on the topic of the IRA definition is, does it become legally binding once Canada and Ontario have officially adopted it?
That's a wonderful, wonderful question, and I wish there was unanimity on this. The answer is that people often quote the fact that when the IRA report came out, it said that this is the non-binding definition of anti-Semitism. So people have said, okay, it's non-binding, and I have two answers to that. First, it was non-binding when the report was issued. It's non-binding on countries, but when countries adopt the definition, in my view, where else do you look for the definition of anti-Semitism other than the definition that has been adopted by government? So in my view, this debate about whether it's binding or non-binding is a little bit of a red herring. It should be the guiding principle that informs decisions that are being made in law. When the U of T injunction case took place, and the judge kind of talked about, and the judge could have just decided it based upon trespass. It was a very simple case. It could have been decided in 10 paragraphs. But then he went on to make a number of comments that were unnecessary as decision that I thought were unfortunate, because a number of them, in my view, my respectful view, were wrong. But when you see how anti-Semitism was dealt with, I keep seeing these commentary that say, well, there's all this uncertainty about what anti-Semitism means and so on and so forth. In my view, there really isn't a lot of uncertainty as to what anti-Semitism means, given the adoption. Now, some provinces, like, for example, I think it's Quebec that has adopted the definition by saying that it's not binding, but nonetheless, they've adopted it, but that qualifying language is not used in Ontario in the order and council that adopted it, or by the federal parliament. So I have some issue with reliance being placed upon its non-binding nature.
Yeah, well, just to follow up, it's interesting to note for anybody who's working on APR that the TDSB is one of the only, if not the only, school board that has adopted the IRAD definition, which they then very conveniently forget until we remind them. So I think the big follow-up question that I have is, what should we be doing? Should we be reporting every single thing that we see, every bit of graffiti that we see, every time we think we may see somebody engaged in intimidation or threats or mischief, or should we all be trying to focus in on the more extreme cases?
So my own view is that let's differentiate graffiti, because in my view, anti-Semitic graffiti should always be reported, and it's very, very important that the graffiti be removed as quickly as possible. And I know there are members of our community who serve as volunteers that rapidly address graffiti in the community and see to its removal, because it sends a wrong message when graffiti is allowed to remain for one day longer than it has to. So I wouldn't say don't report graffiti based upon relative levels of seriousness. But in terms of criminal offenses, I would like to see some selectivity in what's reported, because the police can't investigate 1,000 cases. I would rather that they investigate thoroughly, 20 cases or 30 cases, where there's a clear demarcation, that, or it clearly rises to the level of hate motivated crime. And that's why I say, if it's an obvious case, if people are yelling, are intimidating, harassing, engaging in conduct that is clearly problematic and has to be headed off, otherwise it's going to continue, then that should be reported. In terms of protests, in terms of hate speech on the internet, I think we have to be very selective in what it is that we bring to the police for prosecution.
So that said, what should, like, we, the average citizen, do when we see, is there room for us to amplify the cases that are already being brought to the police services? Should we be vetting any cases that we see through the Jewish organizations? You already said that, to use the Jewish organizations as an intermediary, but I think what I'm really driving at is that everybody who came here today is looking for what are the steps that we should be taking? How can we be active in this issue? How do we force the sea change? How do we amplify the cases that need to have a spotlight on them?
Right. Okay. So in terms of amplification of the cases, one has to be very, very careful that one doesn't taint a case through allowing an argument to be made that it has been unduly influenced, because the criminal justice system is supposed to operate, the famous, statue with justice is blind and so on, is supposed to operate objectively and so on and so forth. So people kind of complaining about why haven't you laid a charge in a specific case and so on, I don't think is helpful. What I think is helpful is that we identify systemic issues in the way our system is dealing with not only hate motivated crimes, but also other legal measures that should be available to address the hatred in our community. So for me, it's more important that the community rally behind certain calls to action that have been identified by us and by others, and by your organization and so on, and get behind those, not putting pressure on in relation to individual cases, as opposed to, testing the system on, are there enough resources for hate crime units? Are there dedicated prosecutors dealing with the cases as opposed to them just being dealt with by any prosecutor that picks up a file? Is extremist financing being given priority in investigations across the country? Is there a unified strategy in how hate crimes are dealt with? Are all police forces across Ontario and Canada receiving what I call scenario-based training, which is the training that I do, where instead of just telling police officers about anti-Semitism or Islamophobia or LGBTQ hatred, that you're actually providing case scenarios for them to work through so that they understand practically how they wrestle with all of these offense sections that I gave you and how they engage in an investigation that's effective and comes to the right result. So for me, I've identified a series of calls to action that I think are of importance, and that's where I think the community can help. I really think that if the community is heard on these themes, on the themes of having, a national strategy around hate crime, on the themes of having training right across the country that is scenario based and so on, and they're making that case to their MPs and their MPPs, and they're making that case, to police services boards, then that's the way I think the community can affect systemic change.
Mark, thank you so much. I think if I can just recap, number one, I think safety first, right? So I think the one thing I really want to caution everybody is that we don't go looking for things, right? Safety first. That if we do find ourselves, I believe the first thing you said, if we find ourselves to be either a victim of a hate crime or an imminent threat of being a victim, either to us or to others, call 911 from a position of safety as best as we can, right? Document, but not at the risk of one's own safety. Right. And if we're taking a video of an event, we take it as completely as we possibly can. We don't stop and turn it off, turn it on, try and edit out the best bits, or edit in rather the best bits. And you also said, and I'm just going to repeat it, that if there's no imminent threat, but we've witnessed what we perceive to be a hate crime, to report it in Toronto at 416-808-2222. If you want to remain anonymous, you can report to Crime Stoppers. You also mentioned that the Toronto Police Services has a specific form on their website dealing with hate graffiti in Toronto. I also know you can call 311, I believe, if you're reporting graffiti as well. And then you also said that there are a multitude of Jewish agencies that can serve as intermediaries, right? And such as Brith, UJA, CJA, Simon
The
Weasley.
Alliance.
Yeah, all of them. Now, but your real call to action, I think at this point, is in order to really evoke a sea change. And I believe that this can be done at all levels of government, federally through a national strategy of hate crime training, resources, or management of hate crimes. We can be lobbying our MPPs. We can be lobbying our city councilors. We should be definitely lobbying our police services board across the country. I hope I've captured really the main themes, but Mark, this is extraordinary. Thank you so much. I think you've really painted a clear picture for all of us. And I, for one, know what I'm supposed to do next.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And the last thing I'm going to mention to you is if you are the victim of a hate motivated crime and you do report it to the police have set up support services. So whether you obtain support services from the Jewish community or from the police, support services are available because these crimes can have a terrible impact upon those who are the subject of them, and you should always avail yourself of the supports that are available inside and outside our community.
Thank you again so much. Just a little bit of housekeeping. we will be sending out notes and action items from this presentation. Revi, let us know if the recording will be made available. I believe you said.
Okay.
I
Okay, I tried to type up everything I could. So I think I have everything and I will be sending that out. And I'm going to try to send out the video to everybody as well. And hopefully within 24 hours.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody. Mark, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
As
Good
always,
night, everyone.
been extraordinary. Good night, everybody.
Good night.